And so we begin our look at topic 1.3, the European exploration in the Americas, which of course is going to lead to the development of America and solidify America's particularly important role in the world, which is the thematic focus of this unit. This age of discovery, also known as the Age of Exploration, was a period in history starting in the 15th century and continuing into the early 17th century, during which Europeans engaged in intensive exploration of the world, establishing direct contacts with Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Oceania, and mapping the planet in the process. The Portuguese and the Spanish traveled long distances over open ocean in search of alternative trade routes to the Indies, motivated by the trade of gold, silver, and spices. This exploration was happening for a variety of reasons, but it transformed the European economy. One of the reasons was for the nations of Europe to challenge the hold that the Italians, especially those in Venice and Florence, had on trade with nations in the eastern Mediterranean and Asia. There was also the desire to spread Christianity in the wake of the spread of Islam. New technological developments, such as better ships that were larger and more maneuverable, increased trade across Europe. The compass and similar tools allowed for navigation away from the coastlines. Better maps and the spread of those maps via the printing press also contributed to this age of exploration. Portugal, particularly under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, tried to challenge the hold of the Italian state on trade across the Mediterranean with the Far East, specifically because luxuries had been flowing into Europe from this direction since the time of the Crusades and immediately following. With the Italians in control of the Mediterranean and the Portuguese controlling access to India via the route around Africa by 1485, the Spanish had nowhere to go except west. With funding provided by Isabella of Castile, Christopher Columbus was able to undertake a voyage to the west with the goal of reaching India and/or China. What Columbus underestimated was the size of the earth and therefore how long it would actually take to reach the Indies. His men were near mutiny when he sighted land in what was probably the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. Discovering Cuba, which he called Hispaniola, and other islands in the West Indies. He quickly returned and was followed by many others, both sailing for Spain as well as other nations. John Cabot, representing England, actually known as Giovanni Caboto, born in Genoa, sailed for England, leaving from Bristol, on May 20, 1497. He reached Belle Island on the northern coast of Newfoundland on June 24th of that same year, sailing down the east coast of Newfoundland to the southern corner, landing on Belle Island, and then returning to England on July 30th, still 1497. His was the fastest crossing of the Atlantic for more than a century. A second expedition was sent out with many more men and ships, but it was never heard from again. Still, although they didn't participate in the exploration and settlement of the New World for nearly a century, his initial voyage staked England's claim to the area. In 1513, you have Juan Ponce de Leon, representing Spain, setting sail from San Germain, Puerto Rico, March 3, 1513, in search of the mythical Fountain of Youth, which was the Europeans' only explanation for why Native Americans didn't grow facial hair. Of course, keep in mind, a lot of this is through pantomime and very limited actual verbal communication, as the two groups didn't speak the same language, so trying to explain a complex concept when you don't speak the same language was quite difficult. On April 2nd of that year, he sighted Florida and went ashore to claim it for Spain, landing on a small inlet near Daytona Beach. He also discovered a strong current, that we now call the Gulf Stream, that forced his ships, which were sailing south, to actually sail backwards. He continued down the coast of Florida, past the Florida Keys, and then up the western coast. Returning home, he sailed west, skirting the Yucatan Peninsula, past the north coast of Cuba, and then back to Puerto Rico, arriving back there in October of 1513. In 1524, we have Giovanni de Verrazzano, representing France, who sailed beginning in January 1524 and made landfall on March 1st at Cape Fear, the southernmost of North Carolina's 3 capes. They sailed south for about 110 miles and then turned north to avoid running into any Spaniards, continuing for another 250 miles along the coast. He explored the coasts of what is today Georgia, North and South Carolina, and even went as far north as New York Bay and Arcadia. His voyage represented a challenge to the New World dominance of Spain. In 1527, you have Panfilo Narvaez, representing Spain, who had a commission to colonize all the lands between Florida and Mexico. He, with a force of about 260 men, landed near St. Petersburg, and then he sent on his ship onto Mexico to wait for him while he marched up the coast of Florida. He traveled northwards, battling native peoples all the way to Appalachia. There they constructed 4 boats and continued on to what is now Pensacola Bay, again fighting the entire way. They crossed the Mississippi River in their boats, though eventually all of those boats were lost, and all were killed, except for 4 men, one being Cabeza de Vaca, who took over the expedition and continued to walk all the way to Texas and then Mexico, with the help of friendly natives that helped feed them along the way. Those 4 survivors eventually reached Mexico City in late July 1536. If you paid attention, that means it took de Vaca and his 4 companions 9 years to complete the trip. From 1534 to 1536, you have Jacques Cartier, representing France, who made landfall at Newfoundland in May of 1534, sailed all around the coast of Newfoundland, Labrador, Arcadia, and all the islands in the area. He returned to France in September of that year and then came back the following year and proceeded to explore the area of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the islands in the Gulf, and even up into Canada itself. They sailed up the St. Lawrence River and arrived at what is now Quebec on September 10th. And on October 2nd, they were at the place where Montreal is today. Now, this is 1535. He wintered that year in Quebec and then returned to France in 1536, setting the precedent for a French claim to Canada. And Hernando de Soto, sailing between 1539 and 1543. He represented Spain, landing near Fort Myers, Florida in May of 1539 with a force of about 570 men and 223 horses. Influenced by Pizarro's actions in Peru, De Soto had no respect for the indigenous population of Florida, and his basic strategy was to enter a native town, capture the chief, demand provisions, then move on to the next village, capture that chief, releasing the chief from the previous village. During his expedition, he killed many native peoples along his trek. Marching northward from Florida into Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, near Memphis, he built barges and crossed the Mississippi River. Now, this is 2 years after having landed in Florida in the first place. They then marched through Arkansas and even Oklahoma, and then back to the Mississippi River, where De Soto died of a fever in May of 1542. His successor, Luis Moscoso, continued the expedition and eventually sailed down the Mississippi across the Gulf of Mexico, arriving in Mexico itself in September of 1543 with 311 men out of the original 570. Between 1541 and 1542, Jacques Cartier was again sailing, representing France, with the intent this time to colonize Canada. In August 1541, his expedition anchored off the banks of the future Quebec, establishing a settlement and continuing their exploration by sailing up the Ottawa River. Although he does arrive in present-day Montreal, he abandoned his efforts when many of his men became ill, mostly with scurvy. Although the Portuguese had been exploring the coast of Africa, the discovery of the Americas led to significant disputes between them and Spain. Eventually, those disputes were settled by the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between Spain and Portugal, along a line of latitude located approximately down the center of the North Atlantic. The agreement started out as a papal bull or decree by the Spanish-born Pope Alexander VI in 1493. After complaints by Portugal that they didn't have enough room at sea for even their African voyages, the line was moved to approximately 1,185 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands in the treaty. And this was eventually approved by the Pope anyway, starting out then as an agreement just between the two nations, and then the Pope gave his seal of approval. The new boundary would enable Portugal to claim the coast of Brazil after its discovery by Pedro Alvarez Cabral in 1500.